There are options, and that's why we need to take this opportunity seriously.
There's no way you can prevent global warming unless China is part of the solution.
This is not normal male behavior. This is predatory behavior.
We don't know how bad this bug is. We don't know what this bug does.
All of that was thrown away in those 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and that's the moment that I became an abolitionist.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Welcome to the Munk Debates. On every episode, we provide you with a civil and substantive debate on the big issue of the day, to arm you, the listener, with enough information to make up your own mind. Today's debate, be it resolved, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan is a tactical and strategic blunder the United States will come to regret.
The U.S. began its final withdrawal from Afghanistan today. The goal is for the last 2,500 American troops plus 7,000 NATO soldiers to be out of the country by the end of the summer.
Major news coming in from Afghanistan tonight. More than 90% of American troops now out of Afghanistan.
As the NATO forces in Afghanistan withdraw, the Taliban are gaining ground. The militants say they've taken more than 10 districts over the past day.
Hello, I'm your moderator, Rudyard Griffiths. Well, 20 years and counting, $800 billion spent, over 2,000 U.S. servicemen and women killed, and thousands more wounded. America, Canada, and NATO's longest war is finally coming to a close as troops have begun to withdraw from their bases in Afghanistan. And while 3/4 of Americans applaud President Biden's decision to pull out ground troops completely, many security experts are sounding the alarm.
Let's be very, very clear. We went into Afghanistan. We have stayed in Afghanistan not to protect Afghans, but to protect Americans. And this military withdrawal and the withdrawal of all the other American agencies that are affected by it, I think risks very grave danger to American national security.
That's former National Security Advisor John Bolton. Critics of America's withdrawal argue that leaving Afghanistan without a secure national government and a functioning military in place will almost certainly lead to a Taliban takeover, massive human rights abuses, and could create the preconditions for the reemergence of extremist groups in the country planning terrorist attacks against the United States and its allies. Others see 20 years of fighting and very little to show for it.
I am very glad that we have a president who has finally recognized that this is not a militarily winnable war, that we're spending $50 billion there, that it's leading to more deaths of Afghan civilians, and it's putting our troops at risk.
That's Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna, a fierce critic of the war in Afghanistan. Like Khanna, many Americans argue that efforts to build up the Afghan forces, install a stable government, and curb corruption were misguided and have ended in failure. America, NATO, and the West can no longer afford to be Afghanistan's policemen. It's time to end the conflict that is no longer in the national interest. On this installment of the Munk Debates, we challenge the essence of these arguments by debating the motion, be it resolved, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan is a tactical and strategic blunder the U.S. will come to regret. Arguing for the motion is former U.S. Marine and intelligence officer Elliot Ackerman. He served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's the author of numerous best-selling books, including the most recently published 2034, a novel of the next world order. Arguing against the motion is Andrew Bacevich. He's a retired U.S. Army colonel, the president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and author of After the Apocalypse, America's Role in a World Transformed. Andrew, Elliot, welcome to the Munk Debates.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much.
Very much looking forward to this conversation between the two of you. We could not be having, in a sense, a more topical debate at this moment. America's longest war, probably Canada's longest war too. Many of our NATO allies coming to a conclusion with the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. What is the fate and future of Afghanistan from here? What have we learned from this conflict. These are some of the key questions that we're going to dive and dig into with both of you, your considered experience and background. It's a privilege indeed for us to have access to that over the next 45 minutes or so. Our resolution, simple to the point, be it resolved, withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan is a tactical and strategic blunder the United States will come to regret. Elliot, you're up first. You're arguing in favor of our motion. So let's hear your opening statement, please.
Thanks so much, Rudyard. I believe, this debate is ultimately about costs as measured in blood and treasure, and which is the more prudent course of action, to cut our losses and leave Afghanistan, or to continue our support for its government and people through an enduring troop presence. At the time of the Biden administration's announced withdrawal, the U.S. troop numbers have hovered at around 3,500. Just to give this a sense of perspective, there are normally nearly 40,000 troops currently garrisoned in Western Europe, and their presence has secured a generations-old peace in the countries where the Second World War was fought. And we also stationed 30,000 troops in South Korea in a decades-long effort to ensure stability in the Pacific. Obviously, Afghanistan today is more volatile, far more volatile than Western Europe or East Asia. But U.S. troops stationed there have remained relatively safe in recent years. 4 Americans died in combat in Afghanistan in 2020. In that same year, more service members died in training accidents at the Camp Pendleton Marine Base alone. Indeed, since 2015, Defense Department training accidents have exceeded combat deaths worldwide. I raise this point not to sound callous about combat deaths, but rather to put them in a context that allows us to create sound policy. Afghanistan today is not the war it was for Americans, say, 10 years ago when I fought there. We've incurred many sunk costs in Afghanistan, the 2,500 dead service members, as well as the trillions spent. I'm not here to debate that the Afghan war has been well prosecuted. It has not. The question before us is how to set sound policy for the future. The current policy, in which the U.S. forfeits the entire enterprise, is strategically ill-advised and nearsighted, particularly given current costs, which are relatively minor. It will lead to greater chaos in the region, embolden adversaries who are open in their antipathy to the United States, and ultimately places a greater risk of having to redeploy numbers of troops, numbers that far exceed 3,500, back to Afghanistan in the future, much like what we saw occur in Iraq after our wholesale withdrawal in 2011 and our subsequent return after the rise of the Islamic State in 2014. And depending on who you speak to, and particularly among veterans, Afghanistan is an emotionally charged subject, and understandably so. Many who've been touched by the war want the war to end. But what does it mean to end a war? Does the war really end when all the troops come home? If you look at our history, the only wars where the troops have all come home are the wars we've lost, like Vietnam. The wars we've won, or at least haven't lost, have all involved an enduring troop presence. I would argue that with 3,500 Americans deployed and minimal combat deaths, the war in Afghanistan, for Americans, largely ended a number of years ago. So why are we pulling out all the troops now? Is this about ending a war, or is it about healing a national wound? If it's about the latter, which I suspect it partly is, unsound policy will only keep the wound festering on long after September 11th, 2021. As much as this policy signals that America is done with Afghanistan, I fear Afghanistan might not be done with America. Thank you.
Thank you, Elliot. Terrific opening statements, setting out some important arguments there for us to consider. Well, Andrew, your opportunity now. You're arguing against our motion, be it resolved, withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan is a tactical and strategic blunder the U.S. will come to regret. Let's have your opening statement.
Yeah, I think I'll begin by focusing on the word blunder, which is contained in the resolution. The blunder, I think, occurred in the autumn and winter of 2001-2002, when following the entry of U.S. forces and the overthrow of the Taliban, the United States and its partners committed itself to an ambitious nation-building project that has proven to be a failure. We have had two purposes in Afghanistan. The first was to build a legitimate government with capital in Kabul, able to govern, to preside over this territorial expanse, and also to bring into existence security forces able to protect the territorial integrity of Afghanistan and also to provide for internal security. So we've been doing that now, attempting to do that now for going on 20 years, and all the evidence suggests that we have failed. So to my mind, staying longer, trying harder, is unlikely to convert that failure into success. Indeed, to a very considerable extent, at least as I see it, one proximate cause of the violence and disorder that racks that country is the presence of foreign forces. In other words, it's when foreign troops leave that the possibility of Afghans settling their own differences and putting the nation on a better track improves. So it just seems to me that the decision of the Biden administration to call an end to a failed war makes all the sense in the world.
Thank you, Andrew. Terrific opening statements from you both. Now an opportunity for rebuttals. So, Elliot, you're up first. Let's hear your reaction to Andrew's opening statement.
Well, first of all, I agree with much of Andrew's opening statement in that, the history of the Afghan war over the last 20 years is certainly a history of blunders. And it's also a history of mission creep and a project that at many times has become far too expansive. So you're not going to hear a lot of disagreement from me there. I think, however, that in order to make sound policy today, that policy is about engaging with the future and less engaging with the past. And it's also about recognizing that the true presence in Afghanistan today and our commitment there in 2021 with a somewhat de minimis number of troops that has led to a stable Afghanistan in so much as the conflict there is relatively stable and the Afghans have been able to shoulder much more of the burden, to me seems like a reasonable enduring expense for Americans to take on, because whether we like it or not, we own the Afghan problem and we can't just walk away with it and believe that it's not going to follow us. Furthermore, yes, I think one of the mistakes the United States made early on in the Afghan war was conflating the Taliban with Al-Qaeda and not understanding that those are two different groups that view the world differently. Al-Qaeda being transnational terrorists, the Taliban being Afghan nationalists. However, I am unconvinced that the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is what is precipitating the violence in Afghanistan. If we look at the 1990s, for instance, there was no significant foreign troop presence in Afghanistan really at all. And that was surely a decade that was marked by massive violence in the country. And I fear that those are the conditions that Afghanistan will return to in short order if this relatively de minimis amount of U.S. troops is withdrawal. Because what those troops signal is that Afghanistan, and the Afghan national government at least, still enjoys the backing of the United States.
Thank you, Elliot. Andrew, your opportunity now for a rebuttal also.
Elliot has referred to, use the phrase, sunk costs. And our sunk costs in Afghanistan are extraordinary. He made brief reference to them. We don't need to rehearse the details. I have to say that I don't think sunk costs provide any reason to persist in a failed enterprise. It ends up being throwing good money after bad. So we disagree on that. He raises the question of strategic priorities. And I think that probably ought to really be central to our further discussion here. And I'll give an opinion that Afghanistan, the future of Afghanistan, should not figure as a strategic priority in the United States. The world today is not the world that existed in 2001 when we first intervened in Afghanistan. And the list of issues that should take priority over Afghanistan, in my judgment, is rather extensive. What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about the changing in the geopolitical order with the rise of China being the most prominent example. We're talking about the changes in the natural order with the worsening climate crisis demanding greater attention, more resources. We're talking about the disunion within the United States and America, embodied by the rise of Trumpism, and of course, in particular, exemplified by the January 6th assault on the Capitol.
Events in Washington have taken a violent and tumultuous turn in the past few hours, as thousands of supporters of President Trump stormed the U.S. Capitol building, venting their anger at the victory of Joe Biden in the presidential election.
We have enormous work to repair our country. That will require attention. It will require resources. By the way, I've just skipped over the pandemic, which has killed 600,000 of our fellow citizens over the course of the past year. So it just seems to me that Afghanistan figures as a peripheral U.S. interest at best. And I must say that from my point of view, without trying to be naive about it, my guess is that the people of Afghanistan are actually better equipped to address and to remedy the problems of Afghanistan than we are. You know, we've made a stab at that for the past 20 years, and it hasn't worked. So we need to attend to other matters that are actually far more relevant to the security and well-being of the American people.
Thank you, Andrew. My opportunity now to join this debate and think up some questions that are top of mind for our audience members, having listened to you both. And thank you for the excellent opening statements and rebuttals. Elliot, let me come back to you with some questions now that I'm thinking up, having listened to you both. And the first goes to Andrew's point of priorities. You know, some people would say of the 101 priorities facing America now, many of which are urgent and which Andrew has just outlined some of the key ones. Afghanistan's just not on that list anymore. The world has changed. This is 2 decades later. American policy needs to change with it. I think I want to hear a bit more from you about why you still think this really is an urgent national priority that warrants putting American and allied NATO soldiers' lives on the line in Afghanistan, potentially for years to come.
Yeah, I'd like to just begin by addressing something that Andrew said, which I think might actually be a miscommunication between us. I think we're actually in agreement, but we just reached different conclusions. With regards to sunk costs, my concern, I also believe that we should not pay attention to the sunk costs of Afghanistan as we make a decision going forward. So I am in total alignment with Andrew on that. However, what I fear is that when we look at the sunk costs, which is a 20-year war, more than 2,500 U.S. service members killed with a massive price tag, that leads us to the conclusion that even though the price tag moving forward is relatively de minimis, we have to leave no matter what. So I agree that the United States has more pressing issues to face than what is going on in Afghanistan. I mean, you know, the last book I wrote, for instance, is about China. And I think that the pivot that is going on in national security circles to China and to the idea of competing with a peer-level adversary is an essential pivot. My concern is that I believe that by pulling all of the troops, meaning 3,500 thereabouts, as opposed to the in excess of 100,000 troops who were fighting there at the height of the war when I served, we are going to throw that region into a level of chaos that involves us then having to pay attention to it once more. If you don't really want to think about Afghanistan for the next 4 to 6 years, station about 3,000 troops there, keep nominally supporting the Afghan government. And I think that is the route to stability in that part of the world, not pulling all the plugs and turning Afghanistan into a black hole like we saw in the 1990s, or repeating the types of strategies we saw at the end of the Obama administration with the pullout from Iraq.
Okay, great points. That's where I wanted to go with you next, Andrew, which is to say, you're arguing, obviously, on the basis that this has been a war that has wasted American blood and treasure and will continue to do so indefinitely. But isn't Elliot right that there has been a substantial change in the tactics and strategies over the last 12 to 18 months? It's a far smaller, scaled-back mission that provides America with some real potential concrete outcomes here. The suppression of al-Qaeda, the prevention of the rise of an ISIS-type event or movement in Afghanistan at a very low cost in terms of materiel, men, and footprint. Why isn't that the right way to go forward with this?
Well, I don't think I'd agree with the characterization. I suppose, given the trillions of dollars that the United States has expended since initiating the so-called global war on terrorism, the amount of money that we're spending in Afghanistan may seem relatively small, but only relatively. I guess the larger point is that stability is going to require a political resolution. I don't believe that the continued U.S. military presence facilitates that. As a matter of fact, I am persuaded that from the point of view of the government in Kabul, the continued presence of U.S. forces provides an excuse to avoid making hard decisions. Again, I think the bottom line comes down to, does the presence of U.S. forces, whether it's mostly symbolic or largely, if it's substantive, does the presence of U.S. forces actually facilitate some kind of resolution to the crisis afflicting Afghanistan? My answer is no, it doesn't. And quite frankly, I give that answer not simply because of the American experience over the past 20 years, but also because of the Soviet experience, because of the British experience. Afghans don't want to be occupied by foreign armies. That seems to be a pretty clear theme in the history of Afghanistan. Afghans want to be the masters of their own fate. I think we should allow them to exercise that privilege.
So, Elliot, come back on that point. By extending, even if you are with a much smaller footprint at, a lower, cost, and if we could just kind of assume the sunk costs or the sunk costs regardless, are we fundamentally missing a piece here in terms of resolving this conflict, which is getting foreign troops out of Afghanistan, letting the Afghan people find their own way, make their own, hopefully, progress towards some type of national reconciliation?
Again, the reason I am for or I am against the withdrawal from Afghanistan is because I believe that the outcome is not going to be what Andrew predicts. And were it to be what Andrew predicts, I would completely be aligned with him. If this was an issue of the Afghans simply needing to fight it out within their own borders to figure out how they wanted to live, I would say that, hey, 20 years of war, it's too bad it had to take that long, but that's ultimately they need to resolve this for themselves. The challenge I find is that, the world is interconnected in ways that it was not before. Recent past has shown us that Afghanistan, certainly if we look at its history, it is a crossroads, and that conflict will swell outside of Afghanistan's borders. And I believe that when we leave, we will see a spike in violence in Afghanistan, akin to what we saw in the 1990s. We will see other actors getting involved in Afghanistan in ways that go against U.S. national interests, and we will find ourselves once again involved in Afghanistan or in the region on terms that are unfavorable to us. And, we saw this occur in 2001 with the September 11th attacks, and we saw this occur again in 2014. So for me, at a certain point, if our insurance policy on that not happening is the deployment of around 3,000 troops and sustaining them in Afghanistan to provide a modicum of stability, I believe that is the less dangerous path. Because, for instance, in 2011, we pulled out of Iraq, and suddenly we weren't talking very much about Iraq. And then in 2014, 15, 16, the entire conversation and all national security priorities were on the Islamic State.
Overseas tonight, another attack being blamed on ISIS, the third mass terror attack carried out by the terror group in the last week. This one, the deadliest in Baghdad in nearly a decade.
And so if we were to see some type of repeat of that, I think it would make it very difficult for the United States now to pay attention to many key issues like the rise of China, like climate, and like our internal dysfunction. So I actually think the way to pivot and pay attention to those issues is to keep the Band-Aid on in Afghanistan.
Andrew, there's the old adage, Colin Powell and others, you break it, you own it. Don't you feel any kind of responsibility to the Afghan people, to the women who were, to a certain extent, given new opportunities that they could not have pondered before foreign occupation, to the people who have placed their faith, their future with the allies and their troops in trying to rebuild this country? I mean, aren't those people owed something?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No question about it. I have not suggested otherwise.
So how does a complete withdrawal of troops provide those people with any protection, any security?
I mean, the way you're posing the question, that suggests that there are no methods of responding to the needs of the Afghan people other than foreign military occupation. I don't think that makes sense. I would make two arguments. The first is particularly related to Afghans who have directly supported U.S. forces, the U.S. effort. There is a moral imperative, unquestioned moral imperative, to provide expeditious exit visas for all those individuals and their families who wish to leave Afghanistan and resettle in the United States. It's their choice whether or not to do so, but we should facilitate that choice. And indeed, Elliot probably has better numbers than I do. I think the current number of these special exit visas authorized is somewhere in the vicinity of, I think, 25,000. That number is totally inadequate, and there should be no red tape that gets in the way of doing that. That's point number one. Point number two, if the Taliban succeeds in overthrowing the government in Kabul, it is quite likely that there will be a humanitarian disaster on a massive scale. We know that happened, for example, after the Soviet invasion, when I think the number was something on the order of 5 million Afghan refugees who left the country, some for Iran, many to Pakistan. Again, we have an absolute moral responsibility to do whatever we can, at whatever cost, to the American taxpayer to try to alleviate the suffering of those people. So it's not my argument that we're just going to wash away from Afghanistan and forget a tragedy to which we ourselves have directly contributed. So, yeah, we have work to do. As the U.S. war comes to an end, we still have responsibilities there.
Hi, Rudyard Griffiths here, your host and moderator. I have a favor to ask you. Please consider becoming a Munk member. Membership is free, and you get access to a series of great benefits, including a 10-plus year library of some of our best debates, dialogues, and podcasts. You also get a free monthly newsletter featuring the debates that we're watching around the world, and you get a specially curated Friday weekly Munk members only podcast that focuses on the big international events and trends shaping our world. All of that, again, free at www.monkdebates.com. I hope you'll consider joining and becoming part of our community. Now, back to our program. Elliot, for a lot of people listening to these various arguments, some would say, look, there's a seduction to your, I think you've characterized it as a Band-Aid, but isn't there reality that what begins as a Band-Aid suddenly becomes something a lot bigger? It becomes, surgery. It becomes, stitches. It becomes a critical wound. It's suddenly, we're back to surging. I mean, why do you think a Band-Aid is a sustainable approach when we see the Taliban consistently gaining territory, now up-arming on the basis of large caches of weapons captured from an Afghan military that is kind of collapsing? So why are you confident that your idea of a Band-Aid remains a Band-Aid and that we're not back having a conversation like this a year or two from now with a substantial surge of U.S. troops into Kabul and Kandahar?
Well, first of all, if we were talking about, cost numbers here and sustaining a U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, that was, significant amounts of troops, 50, 60, 70,000 U.S. troops surging into Afghanistan with the attendant price tag, I would probably be sitting on Andrew's side of the debate saying at this point, it's not worth it. So with the information we have now, it is a relatively modest-sized force, and and we're talking about the decision to be made today. That being said, we can't look, I think, at what is going on in Afghanistan right now in these Taliban advances outside of the context of this political reality, which is that we are leaving. Ultimately, they say, politics is retail. Well, guess what? Counterinsurgency is very retail too. I've spent a lot of my life sitting down from tribal elders and others and drinking tea with them and looking them in the eye and providing them with assurances that American resolve is strong, and if they throw their lot in with us, that their future is secured for the next decade or 2 decades. I think when we're going forward, we need to be very pragmatic. What are the costs? And just to Andrew's point, I agree with everything, that we have an obligation to the Afghan people, whether it's visas, whether it's supporting the humanitarian disaster that I imagine will probably follow. My retort to that would simply be, hey, if we're going to be paying for something as the American people, why not pay for those troops to stay in Afghanistan at a relatively low rate as opposed to paying for the humanitarian disaster that we know is going to follow?
Thank you, Elliot. Let's go bigger picture in our remaining moments together. Andrew, come to you first about how does a withdrawal of all troops from Afghanistan signal America's ability to continue to project and defend a liberal international order internationally? I mean, to what extent does this really create, as Elliot suggested, some awareness on the part of America's other allies, think Taiwan, that America's not really in it for the long haul? They're not really there to provide the necessary support, as they did in South Korea now, as Elliot mentions, for decades, or in Europe for decades also. This is a new America, a cut and run America, not an America that you necessarily want as a global partner.
The question recalls a comment made by George Kennan, the famous diplomat and historian, in the context of the Vietnam War. When that war went badly, some arguments for staying the course insisted that we needed to do so in order to shore up American credibility, that if the United States withdrew from Vietnam, that we would no longer be viewed as a trustworthy ally. And Kennan's response to that was no, that if you embark upon a foolhardy war, then terminating that war actually signals to others good sense, wisdom. My judgment is that the Afghanistan war has been a foolhardy war, and that therefore terminating the war doesn't hurt our credibility. It signals that we finally wised up. Now, let me admit that, to my mind, this discussion happens in this larger context, a larger context related to the central themes of U.S. policy since the end of the Cold War. I believe that since the end of the Cold War, U.S. policy has become excessively militarized. The failed Afghanistan war is one example of where this militarization of U.S. policy has misled us. In a new world, new geopolitically, new in the sense of other concerns rising to the fore, it seems to me to be very useful to do what we can do to begin to back away from this excessive militarization. And to my mind, terminating U.S. involvement in the Afghanistan war offers one small step toward that larger purpose.
Interesting analysis. So, Elliot, what's your perspective on that? I mean, people would say, look, we are in a new geopolitical reality. It needs to be acknowledged. And as Andrew said, this militarization of America's engagement with the world is precisely at the root of, the failure of the policy in Afghanistan, Iraq. It's at the danger of being at the root of America's next military failure, possibly Taiwan. What's your view?
I don't disagree with Andrew that U.S. policy post the Second World War has become excessively militarized. Where I think there might be a little bit of daylight between us is the idea that, Afghanistan has been a foolhardy war. And let me just explain. I would say that there have been a number of Afghan wars The first is the war fought immediately after the September 11th attacks, which, there was much to be desired in the prosecution of that and the hunt for bin Laden, but I would not say that was a foolhardy conflict. I remember what those attacks were like. I'm sure Andrew does as well. I think, the nation was at that point going to war. The scope of that war and allowing it to creep into all sorts of facets in a nation building project, I think is what was foolhardy. I don't think, a response in Afghanistan to the September 11th attacks was foolhardy. But I fully agree that our conception of war as Americans post the Second World War has left a lot to be desired. The Second World War, I think, is very much still our American story. We expect our wars to kind of adhere to that narrative where there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, and we're the good guys. And everyone comes home. And I would just offer one observation. I remember when I was in high school, I read the Iliad, the copies of the Iliad that they handed out to my class had a single image on the cover. It said in red lettering, Iliad, and there was a photograph of a bunch of U.S. service members landing on Omaha Beach. And I think we as Americans need to kind of update our national Iliad as we imagine wars going forward, for instance, in a place like Taiwan.
Well said. As we move towards closing statements, I want you to respond, Andrew, to this idea that, we're in a twilight period, and it's going to be a period of the necessity for America's continuing engagement in the world, including using military power and force. Maybe that engagement is going to have new features. It's going to be a little bit more judicious, more calibrated, as Elliot is suggesting, in terms of a way to extend the Afghanistan mission. Am I right to characterize your view, Andrew, as one that, it really is time to focus on America at home and you oppose any foreign intervention? Or where do you draw the lines? I'm kind of interested in your thinking here in that process.
If you're saying, Andrew, are you an isolationist? The answer is no. Matter of fact, I think isolationism is a fiction. I believe that it's absolutely imperative for the United States to be actively, comprehensively engaged in the world. We can't solve our problems unless we are comprehensively engaged. When you think of things like the climate crisis or cyber crime, we have to be engaged. I do believe, however, that the emphasis on military power as a preferred instrument for engagement, particularly since the end of the Cold War, has been profoundly misguided. And therefore, we need to rethink the terms of our engagement and rethink our priorities, where, frankly, Afghanistan doesn't rank very high. Now, Elliot said something that was genuinely profound when he referenced World War II and the overhang of World War II down to the present moment as sort of a narrative source or reference point to which we reflexively return. I think he's exactly right. In some respects, in our collective consciousness, we still imagine that it's, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill standing arm in arm, fighting the good fight against the Third Reich.
Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit upland.
But that's not where we are today. History has moved on. And I think we need to wean ourselves from this conviction that somehow the narrative of World War II provides essential guidance to understand where we are today and what we need to do today. And I believe that to do that, to rethink that narrative, brings us to a clearer understanding of why the emphasis on military power, Afghanistan being one example, has been misguided, and we really need to rethink that.
Thank you. Look, before we go to closing statements, Elliot, I want to ask you maybe a somewhat personal question, but having served in combat with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan, what are the conversations that you're having with your fellow veterans about the end of this war? How do they feel about this? What are they kind of trying to understand in terms of the decision now that's been made and how that possibly reflects on their own perceptions of their own service and sacrifice?
I would offer that sort of, friends of mine who are veterans who kind of fall into, generally speaking, experientially, one of three camps, right? Those of us who fought in Iraq, those of us who fought in Afghanistan, and those of us who fought in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The conversations I've been having with those who just served in Iraq is they're sort of looking at the Afghan war veterans saying, well, I've sort of been through this before when Iraq ended and having to reckon with what the ending of a war meant. I think for those who just served in Afghanistan, it's a new experience to see your war coming to an end. And then among the most interesting conversations I've sort of had have been among my cohort who served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, because we're kind of going through this for a second time. And, speaking to someone I really respect who served in the Marine Corps as a contemporary of mine, he and I were both noting the other day, why does this one feel a little bit more bitter than Iraq? And I think that's sort of the consensus that we landed on was that, the Iraq war was always ill-advised. Even when we were there, most of us who were fighting it knew that, at least from a strategic point of view, as we were combing the desert for WMDs that were obviously they didn't exist, that this was not a war fought with a clear pretense. And that Afghanistan stings because, again, this was a war that was initiated based off of an attack on our homeland. That happened once before, which led to this story, the Second World War. And now it happened a second time, and this will be a war that we have lost, and we are the veterans of that lost war. And that stings in a different way. So I would offer that observation.
Let me reference Elliot's remark where he said he showed up late to two wars. I showed up late to my one war. I showed up late to the Vietnam War when obviously the war was already lost. At the time, in the immediate aftermath, let's say in the mid-late 1970s, I had a very difficult time reckoning with the meaning of that entire experience. I certainly had a very difficult time placing the Vietnam War in the narrative of American history. Only with the passage of time, as I'm speaking for myself, I'm not presuming to speak for Elliot, only with the passage of time did I come to have what I believe to be a clearer understanding of the Vietnam War, that it was an unnecessary debacle that did great damage to our country. My guess is that with the passage of time, as we think about the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, they're always going to be linked together, that we will come collectively to a similar understanding of those two major post 9/11 wars, while granting that at a particular moment, it's difficult to see those events in any kind of historical perspective.
Let's go to closing statements. Our debate today has been, be it resolved, withdrawing the U.S. troops from Afghanistan is a tactical and strategic blunder the U.S. will come to regret. Andrew, what key points or ideas do you want to leave our audience with as you argue throughout this debate against our motion today?
I think it's important for us to acknowledge that just because U.S. forces are leaving doesn't mean the war ends. War continues. The war will be decided by the Afghan people. If we go by news reports at the present moment, the outcome looks to be bleak. And if indeed it turns out that the Taliban is able once again to prevail, that will be a tragedy. It's a tragedy for which the United States will be, to a considerable degree, responsible. And therefore, to emphasize the point that I made earlier, despite the fact that I think it's time for us to end our involvement in the war, our military involvement into war, there's absolutely no question that as events evolve, the United States will continue to have a profound responsibility for what happens next.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, we're going to give our last word in this debate to Elliot, who's been arguing in favor of our motion, be it resolved, withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan is a tactical and strategic blunder the U.S. will come to regret. Elliot, wrap this debate up for us.
Well, although I've been arguing in favor of the motion, I would certainly say that I am rooting for the motion's failure, and that for this not to be a decision that we regret. We spoke a little bit throughout this debate about the Second World War and how that story has loomed very large in the American national consciousness as we think about the ways that we prosecute wars. And I would also observe that, the zeitgeist, the emotional zeitgeist of the country really matters as we make these policy decisions. And even though it shouldn't be the case, oftentimes our emotions can lead us to make faulty policy decisions that are not deeply rooted in kind of more pragmatic considerations. I would say that probably one of the first times we made a faulty and somewhat emotionally based policy decision that was rooted in the national zeitgeist was actually right after the September 11th attacks. One sort of bit of trivia I would offer is that because we talked about the Second World War, the television series Band of Brothers, which I think is a pure distillation of that greatest generation American way of war. That television series premiered on September 10th, 2001. And I only bring that up because that to me was somewhat an indicator, or at least a barometer of the national zeitgeist as we went into these wars. We craved a great national war story. And as we come out of these wars now 20 years later, the national zeitgeist, I would say, has turned 180 degrees, and there's a strain of cynicism and dysfunction that exists in the United States right now, and that I think makes it emotionally easy for us to walk away. And I think, wouldn't it be a better irony if at the end of the Afghan war, it was a failure because we overzealously pursued two emotional moods in the country, and those moods led us to make poor policy decisions.
Thank you, Elliot. A profound point to end on. And I want to just thank both of you on behalf of the Munk Debates community, first for your service. I want to acknowledge that. And also for engaging in this debate in such a kind of civil, substantive, and rich way, filled with analogies to history, analogies to the current events and the current context that we find ourselves in. This has just been an incredibly rich and informing debate, and we're all the better for your participation. So thank you again, both gentlemen, for coming on the Munk Debates today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, that wraps up today's debate. I want to thank our participants, Andrew and Elliot. They certainly gave us a lot to think about. If you have feedback or reflections on what you've just heard, please send us an email to podcast@munkdebates, that's MUNK, debateswithans.com. Here's a recent listener email from John about our Munk Members podcast. John writes, "Dear Rudyard, it appears to me that I and most internet users are blissfully unaware about the increasingly serious nature of internet security, such as you highlighted in your recent podcast. I, as a result, have maintained a landline and resisted wholesale going over to a smartphone. I find it interesting that your co-host Janice has also reconnected her landline for the same reason, cyber security in uncertain times." Hey, thank you, John, for that thoughtful note, and a reminder to all of our listeners of this podcast that you can access our free Munk Members podcast every Friday by becoming a Munk member. Membership is free, and it's available at www.munkdebates.com/membership. Thank you for being part of our community and our efforts to restore the art of civil and substantive debate in our time. Until our next program, I'm your host and moderator, Rudyard Griffiths.
The Munk Debates are produced by Antica Productions and supported by the Munk Foundation. Rudyard Griffiths and Ricky Gurwitz are the producers. Api Raheja is the associate producer. The Munk Debate podcast is mixed by Kieran Lynch. The president of Antica Productions is Stuart Cox. Be sure to download and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like us, feel free to give us a 5-star rating. Thank you again for listening.